Once upon a time, not too long ago, there was this thing that used to exist between people. The only way I can describe it is nothingness. So you're waiting for your table at a restaurant. The hostess says, 20 minutes. And you find a spot near the bar or along the wall and you just exist next to each other. Maybe you people watch or you talk about nothing in particular. Or you talk about that thing that happened at work or what's going on with so and so. Maybe you laugh about something stupid, and somewhere in there, without thinking about it, your hand finds the small of their back. You lean into each other, you stand close enough that your shoulders touch, and that nothing was actually something. We just didn't have a name for it. And what's going on in those spaces now is changing not just how we connect, but whether we touch each other at all. Hey, lovers. This is Sex in Real Life. Honest conversations about sex and relationships beyond 40. I'm your host, Stacey Herrera. Now, when the hostess says 20 minutes, the phones come out. Both of them, usually. And whatever was going to happen in that space where nothing used to exist doesn't happen anymore. The conversation might have started, but maybe it doesn't. The laughs are unlaughed, and the hand that could have possibly found the small of a back either stays in a pocket or is holding a phone. Two people stand next to each other in the same physical space, but not touching, and each of them is actually somewhere else. It's the same at the movie theater. You're standing in line before the doors open, and that blank space where nothing exists, maybe it lasts about 4 seconds before something fills it. And whatever physical closeness might have happened in that blank space, the casual contact, the leaning in, it just doesn't because both sets of hands are occupied, usually with a phone, a tablet, a device, mostly a phone if you're at the movie theater. But, when we think about this, we might think it's a young person problem, but that's not true because you and me, we are of the generation that knew what it was like when those gaps were there and we didn't rush to fill them. I mean, we didn't have anything to fill them with. Phones, pocket phones didn't exist. And even when they did, they were too fucking big to carry in your pocket. But anyway, we have a reference point. We lived before, but the thing about the brain's reward system, it doesn't care how old you are. The algorithms are designed by some of the smartest people in the world, and they're designed to keep you engaged. And it works on everyone. It doesn't matter, what generation you're from. And knowing better, because again, we lived before and we know better, but knowing better doesn't translate into doing differently. The phone still comes out. I mean, mine does too, so no judgment. And it's not even really, it's not a feeling, it's the reaching, which is compulsive, right? And it's an automatic response to unconsciously recognizing that there is space that could be filled. And so you're not just deciding to pick up your phone, you're just picking it up because it's unconscious. And if you're self aware enough to catch it, then you can have a little conversation with yourself and put it down, right? But a lot of people aren't catching it. And if you're not self aware enough to notice, then you can't self reflect enough to realize what the habit is doing. Even better still, like what it's costing you or who it's costing you. I want to be a little bit specific about intimacy. And I know you've heard me say this a million times, but it bears repeating because intimacy and sex are not the same thing. Intimacy is closeness, Um, I guess you could say connection, but that's not always true. But it is about like being close, like this sense of being near someone in a way that matters. And when I say near, that could be emotional, that could be physical, that could be intellectual. There's a lot of different kinds of intimacy. And sometimes intimacy is sexy, and sometimes it leads to sex, but it doesn't require sexiness or sex to be real. I mean, you can be deeply intimate with someone while you're fully clothed in a restaurant waiting area, talking about absolutely nothing. And you can have sex with someone and feel no intimacy at all. So when it comes to the screens that are basically stealing something away from us, well, stealing would imply that we don't have choice, right? So that we're offering, we're offering, it isn't about sex, it's about intimacy. And intimacy lives in the body as much as it lives anywhere else, in touch, a hand on a neck, the knee against knee under the table, arms around a shoulder, in those small things. And that physical proximity that creates physical closeness is foundational, because when emotional intimacy creates the conditions for physical intimacy, that builds over those empty spaces, unhurried conversations, two people or more paying attention to each other. And that closeness is what makes you reach for one another. Those small touches throughout the day, maybe they're mostly unplanned or, incidental, sometimes accidental, but those are the things that keep bodies familiar with each other. And when you feel those spaces where those incidental, unplanned, accidental touches could happen, when you fill those spaces with screens, you don't just lose the conversation, you're also losing the touch. You're losing the thread that runs from a hand on the back to somewhere that could be a little more sexy later. So imagine you're making dinner together. One of you is at the stove, the other is at the kitchen island. Maybe you're chopping, some onions or some peppers or whatever. And maybe there's a glass of wine. And that scenario used to be one of those naturally intimate moments in a shared life. So, you're just doing your thing, cooking, moving around each other. Maybe one of you passes behind you and you rest your hand on their hip or kiss a shoulder. There's just this playful physical contact between two people in a confined space. But now, if you're lucky, and your partner is sitting at that island. Maybe they're not helping, maybe they're not chopping or doing anything, but they're probably on their phone, right? And maybe, technically speaking, they're talking to you because, they laugh and try to show you a meme and tell you what so and so posted, and they're sharing content, though. That's not connection. And because of this extra party, the phone, you're probably not finding a hand on anybody's hip. And so that space that used to be full of all these opportunity for these micro touches is now void of that. And the only thing that's being touched is a screen and the spoon that's stirring the pot. Or think about like coming home at the end of a day, the transitional space where you're walking through the door after hours apart. And that can be intimate too, right? The hug that maybe it lasts a beat longer than necessary because, again, you haven't seen each other all day and you're catching up. And there's this re entry point where you're coming back into each other's orbit. But now, with all this blue light, the greeting is a little bit quicker. Maybe there's a peck. If you're lucky, it's on the mouth. But then everyone finds their corner and their device. So the hugs are getting shorter. The kiss that could have been a little bit more salacious is now just a really quick peck. There's no registering of lips on lips. And sometimes there's just a word that you call from across the room because rather than this delicious, unrecognizable re-entry point into each other's orbit, now you're just returning to the screen instead of each other's arms. I mean, isn't it sad, right? Isn't it sad? But here's the part that I think we probably don't think about a lot because it isn't just the absence of touch. It's what happens to touch when the body isn't in a state to receive it. Because this blue light thing feeds the circadian rhythm. I mean, in natural settings, blue light happens at the peak of a day because it is natural. Well, there are natural forms of it, but the phones is not natural. But usually it's like peak day. Like there's this small window right before the light starts fading, almost like the midday sun, right? But when you are on this constant diet of artificial blue light, which we all are, the brain doesn't get the signal that the wind down is happening. Again, midday sun, after that, the light starts slowly fading. But unnatural blue light doesn't work like that. So your brain doesn't know that the wind down is happening. And even if you are able to fall asleep, because some people are lucky enough to be able to fall asleep no matter what. But if you're lucky enough to be able to fall asleep, even if you are someone who can scroll until midnight and still drift off, that doesn't mean that your body is resting. After being overstimulated for so long, the brain doesn't fully power down. And so that leaves this low grade, should I call it irritation? Maybe it's irritation that you might not notice. So now, if a hand lands on you and you are not fully rested, your body receives that differently than when you are, rested. So if you're in the middle of scrolling and caught up in whatever is going on the screen and your partner touches you, your instinct might not be to lean into it. You might flinch or swat their hand away. And it has nothing to do with love. It's just that your nervous system is wired and hopped up. And so the touch might register as an interruption rather than an invitation, you know? And that swatting away, it might feel like a small thing. Maybe you don't mean anything by it, but the other person, even if they're not completely cognizant, they are clocking that. And if that happens enough times, they probably won't reach as often as they used to. And it won't be dramatic because everything, although we humans are very dramatic, but everything we do is not dramatic, especially if we are not fully in the room when something goes down, right? So they might not realize that they aren't reaching out as much, or you probably don't realize it. So then there's this distance that starts growing on both sides because, each of you might be too wired to receive touch, and each of you also might be slowly learning not to extend a hand. And that's how two people who share a literal or metaphorical bed end up on opposite sides of it. There's not like a big giant rupture all the time. Sometimes there's just these thousands of tiny moments where bodies are too stimulated to realize that they're longing and needing touch. But then that screen is right there because it's easier to stroke a screen than it is to touch a person, right? I mean, bedrooms used to be where the day ended and if there was a time when people slept in two separate beds, but we're not talking about back then. But, it used to be where the day ended and you found each other in the dark. But now, sometimes in a lot of bedrooms everywhere, it's just another room where people are scrolling side by side, together but separate, in the same bed but not touching, just faces illuminated by small deviously inhibitive small rectangles. And I'm not hating on phones. I love mine, right? But there's a loneliness, we are experiencing a loneliness epidemic, and it's coming from so many different angles. But this, I promise you, is one of the ways that it is really, really getting us. I mean, and this happens, not just in romantic relationship, because it happens in groups too, family, friends, whatever. There's always one or two people who, instead of engaging with the people in the room, are on their phones. And sometimes it's not even quiet because you can scroll in silence, but there's always that one person who wants to watch a video at full volume in the middle of a conversation, right? So disruptive. It's so disruptive. I mean, yeah, and it's rude, but beyond the rudeness, it signals that whatever is happening on the screen is more compelling than what's happening right in front of them, right? My partner and I love road trips. I mean, sometimes, we're in the car for hours at a time with one another. And when we are doing a road trip, I'm often the passenger, and I don't do a lot of scrolling then. And part of that is because I am usually in awe of whatever's going on outside, especially if it's like a scenic route. So I'm in awe of what's going on outside. And sometimes I'm talking about what I see or what he sees. And sometimes we ride in silence. There are times when we might listen to a podcast, and talk about what's going on, what we're hearing or whatever. But mostly we're just two people in a small container that is called a vehicle, right? And his hand is on my leg, and we don't always need to fill in the quiet spaces. But that's so different than sitting next to somebody. I mean, obviously, both people can't scroll while you're in the car, but it's just so different than sitting next to each other being somewhere else. But my partner and I are not exempt from this whole phone scroll thing. I mean, I do catch myself, reaching for my phone when we're doing things together. And he has a habit of answering texts in the middle of dinner sometimes, and I have to point it out, so we're just as tethered as everybody else. So definitely not a story of two people who got it all figured out, because we don't. But the thing that we do have, that we are being really intentional about and have been for years, is sometimes in the middle of the day, one of us will ask the other, "Got time for a cuddle?" And it's not planned at all. Usually we're both lost in our individual, cubby holes of work and doing all the things. But when the other person asks that, there is no reading between the lines. It's like, "You got time for a cuddle?" And the other person will say yes. Or maybe sometimes I might say, like, "Give me 5 minutes to wrap something up," or he might say that. But then we both take off our clothes, everything, and climb into bed. And this is not about sex mostly. I mean, sometimes it happens, but the nakedness is about removing obstacles and distance. So we're taking off every layer, and our phones are not on the nightstands. We are just two bodies in a bed touching with nothing between us. Nothing else is pulling at our attention. And sometimes these cuddles last for 10 minutes or an hour. Sometimes they lead to somewhere else, but mostly they don't. Mostly we just are being together skin to skin and making sure that we are prioritizing touch and physical closeness and intimacy. During those cuddle sessions are sometimes where we have some of our deepest conversations. Every now and then it's some place where we might unpack something that we haven't finished tying up, some little repairs. We try not to repair big things in bed, because sometimes you do need a neutral space to like unpack heavy things. But mostly these middle of the day cuddles are really just a place where we go to make sure that we are still in tune with one another. I recommend it. We've been doing this for years, and it hasn't become mundane, even though it's something we do all the time. It doesn't feel like a chore. I mean, it's pretty effortless, honestly. But it tells me that this is kind of how you can manage the technology that we are living in, which is so helpful. I'm not at all villainizing technology. It's so helpful. There's so many things, so many people that I would never have met without these devices. So, but there's a place for them. And there's also a place for physical closeness, connection, and there is a necessity for nothingness, with ourselves and with each other. So the blank spaces don't always need to be filled. Sometimes we can use those spaces for touch, and sometimes we could just be with each other. If any of this landed, if you also recognize, those now filled spaces, share this with somebody who is probably in the same boat, which is basically everyone. It's basically everyone. So share this episode far and wide on your socials, drop it in a text message because I know you're holding your phone. And if you haven't already, and if you feel inclined, take a moment to leave a rating or a short review. That really does help other people to find these conversations. Next week, we are going to be starting a 4-episode series about good sex. You definitely don't want to miss it. I hope you tune in. In the meantime, ciao.